Let me ask you about the Hyde Amendment.
Yeah.
Do you believe Vice President Biden changed his position for political reasons?
I mean, I don't know what else to think. He accused Kirsten Gillibrand. He accuses others of changing their position because of, they're running for office. And I'm going to tell you on the issue that he can't call somebody one thing and then not admit to the other. And the fact is that on the issue of the Hyde Amendment, for decades he took one position, and now running this time for president.
Do you believe he's pro-choice?
If he says he is, I believe him, but I also know his track record on the issue of the Hyde Amendment, which was what? It was about, Chris, it was about denying and restricting access for poor women to have reproductive health care. And also in the case of rape and incest. And I personally prosecuted those cases.
Is this a character issue for you?
It's an issue of where do you stand on a basic issue about women's health. And, especially at this date and time in 2019, where we have state legislatures like Alabama and in Georgia, possibly in Missouri, passing legislation that will essentially deny women access to reproductive health. We need to have a president of the United States who is unambiguous in their support of a woman's right to have access to reproductive health care. Because it's one thing to say I'm pro-choice, it's another thing to then support laws that actually don't allow women to have access to reproductive choice.
You've had some fundamental disputes with the Vice President, former Vice President. The issues about immigration, the issues about health care. How do you resolve these in terms of a party platform? Platforms still matter, something you unite behind.
Oh, I agree.
How do you do that?
Well, we're going to all come together, and I have no question about that. Because there is no question to me that our common values are so much more strong than those issues that might divide us. And one thing I am certain of is that the Democrats on this stage are united in knowing that Donald Trump must be defeated. And that Donald Trump must be defeated, and that he is not in the best interest of our nation, the security of our nation, or the progress of our nation.
Is he a racist?
Yes, he is.
And define that.
Well, let's look at his conduct. He has been, and consistently from day one, making statements that are about, S-hole countries, speaking of African nations, speaking of places like Baltimore where communities of color live, and basically suggesting that no human would or should live there. Speaking of women of color who are serving in the United States Congress and telling them to go back where they came from. One of his first acts as president was to pass a Muslim ban targeting people based on their faith. And on and on and on. There is no question. Speaking about the people are equal on both sides. And here's the thing, Chris. He has used the power of the office of the President of the United States to use this kind of language. It's one thing if you're talking about somebody on the schoolyard. Yeah. It's another thing when you're talking about the President of the United States. The microphone that is held by the President of the United States must always be used in a way that is about lifting people up and finding the commonalities between us and talking about that and encouraging Americans to see those things we have in common, instead of what he has done, which is continually try to sow hate and division among us. It is making us weak. It will make us weak as we go forward unless we get this guy out of office. I plan to be the next president of the United States, and I'm going to tell you how I use that microphone. It will be about lifting people up and saying, hey guys, the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us, and that is the strength of who we are as a nation.
You spoke in the last debate about being 6 years old. I think a lot of people can remember a few things from that young. Do you feel that he's one of those voices on the schoolyard? Is he like the kids that were troubling on race?
Well, he's a bully, and he picks on people he believes to be vulnerable. He picks on people that he perceives to be weak. He picks on people who are in need of help, often desperate for help. And I think those are all signs of not only somebody who's a bully, but somebody who's a coward. Especially when in the same person he's constantly embracing the so-called strongmen. So instead of believing and trusting in the American intelligence community, he prefers to rely on the word of the Russian president on the fact of Russia's interference in the election of the President of the United States. Instead of relying on the American intelligence community, On the issue of an American student who was tortured and later died, he prefers to take the word of a North Korean dictator instead of trusting the American intelligence community on the issue of a journalist who was assassinated.
Of course.
He prefers to take the word of a Saudi prince.
An American resident. Let me ask you a last question. If he pulls that Godzilla number on you like he did with Hillary Clinton and comes up looming behind you during a presidential debate and you felt his presence behind you, what would you do?
Stay tuned. Stay tight.
Thank you.
Keep watching.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.